Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the Understanding Your Adrenals webinar series on ZubiaLive. My name is Winslow Dixon. I'm a holistic health practitioner, a published author, and founder of the Adrenal Alternatives Foundation. And today, like I said, is episode 3 of the Understanding Your Adrenals series. And we will be discussing all of the adrenal diseases and issues that can happen. Last week, we talked about adrenal fatigue, and we talked about the differences between adrenal fatigue and adrenal insufficiency. And so today, we're going to be talking about the different forms of adrenal insufficiency and some other things that can happen in the adrenal gland. So first, I want to address the disease that I have come to know very well because I have it. Primary adrenal insufficiency is also known as Addison's disease. This disease is the autoimmune destruction of the adrenal glands. And one of the most famous people to have ever had this disease was actually President John F. Kennedy. And he had this disease because he had a case of tuberculosis so severe that it actually destroyed his adrenals. So he, while he was president, battled Addison's disease as well. The treatment was very different back then. He actually took bovine adrenal extract, which is from cows, and so he didn't take hydrocortisone like the rest of us, but that was just an interesting fact for your history books. Okay, so the second form of adrenal insufficiency is SAI, which is referred to as secondary adrenal insufficiency. And I've heard some people say there's secondary Addison's disease, but that's actually not true. Addison's disease refers to the autoimmune destruction, and that is the only form. So there's technically no such thing as secondary Addison's disease. Secondary adrenal insufficiency can have many different causes. A common cause is typically a pituitary tumor because the pituitary gland, which is in your brain, produces a chemical called ACTH. And ACTH is what stimulates your adrenal glands to produce cortisol, aldosterone, and all the other hormones. And so if there is a pituitary tumor, it can inhibit the secretion of this hormone. So SAI can sometimes be caused by that. SAI can also be caused by a traumatic brain injury. There are people that have been in car accidents, severe accidents or injury or something like that have had issues with their brain being impacted, and it has shut down pituitary function and caused them to have adrenal insufficiency. So that's another source. SAI can also be caused by steroid suppression. So for example, let's say that you have a disease that's autoimmune, such as rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or something, and they put you on prednisone or dexamethasone or something to try to get your SED rate and your inflammation down. Long-term steroid use can actually cause steroid suppression or adrenal suppression. And what happens is your body gets used to it having that steroid, and so it will cease its own secretion of those hormones. So if you're on a steroid for another issue, like I said, lupus, autoimmune issues, MS, you really need to have your adrenal function assessed if you're on a long-term steroid, because secondary adrenal insufficiency can happen. Fortunately, if it's caught early enough, it can be reversed. So like I said, be in touch with your rheumatologist, your physician about that. Another form of adrenal insufficiency is referred to as tertiary, and this is the rarest form. It's actually when the hypothalamus fails to do its job. Like we talked about the endocrine system last week, it's a connective system. Your whole body works as a synergetic machine. And so the hypothalamus is what triggers the pituitary to function. And so in tertiary adrenal insufficiency, the hypothalamus doesn't trigger the pituitary, so the pituitary doesn't trigger the adrenals, and it's just a cascading issue. So that's tertiary adrenal insufficiency. Other adrenal diseases are Cushing's disease. Now, I want to make the difference between Cushing's syndrome and Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease can also be caused by pituitary tumor. Cushing's disease is where you have production of too much cortisol in your body. The nursing acronym is cushion. You have a cushion of the cortisol hormone. You have way too much cortisol in your body. And so that can, like I said, be caused by pituitary tumor. It can be caused by a lot of different things. Some people have idiopathic versions of it where there's no reason, their body just produces more cortisol. Unfortunately, the treatment for that is they go in and they do something called a BLA, which is a bilateral adrenalectomy. So they then take your adrenal glands sometimes as a treatment for that, which then gives you Addison's disease. So that's kind of an unfortunate treatment. But Cushing's syndrome, I want to also explain. If you are on a steroid for another disease, like I previously mentioned, lupus, MS, or anything like that, you can actually develop Cushing's syndrome, which is the excess cortisol in your system. So Cushing's syndrome is cured when you go off of your steroid. Cushing's disease is a little more difficult to treat, and a lot of times it results in you ending up with the adrenal insufficiency. But anyways, there are other forms of adrenal disease. Conn's syndrome is isolated aldosterone deficiency. So Conn's syndrome is basically where your body doesn't make the appropriate amount of aldosterone. You can have too much or too little. Conn's is very, very rare. Sheehan's syndrome is also another form of adrenal insufficiency, and there are also adrenal tumors. And these adrenal tumors are diagnosed by testing the adrenal catecholamines, which are basically other chemicals that the adrenals produce. And the symptoms of that are high blood pressure and things like that, and those are also very rare. Unfortunately, that's treatable because they can go in and take out the adrenal tumors and restore you to normal function. So those are the basic diseases: primary Addison's, secondary adrenal insufficiency, tertiary, Cushing's, Sheehan's, and Conn's. So the testing for AI. If you think that you're having adrenal issues, if you're having all kinds of issues, adrenal issues show up differently in different people. This disease is sometimes referred to as syndrome X because it presents so differently in everyone. Pretty much the only baseline symptom that adrenal sufferers have is the craving for salt. Before I was diagnosed, I would eat salt kernels out of a jar because I wanted salt that bad. Adrenal insufficiency is a salt wasting disease, so your body doesn't hold on to the electrolytes appropriately. So if you're craving salt, I definitely recommend that you have your adrenals tested. So how do you have your adrenals tested? So if you go to a reputable endocrinologist that knows about adrenal disease, they're going to do something called an ACTH stimulation test. And ACTH, like I said, is the chemical that the pituitary produces to stimulate the adrenal glands. So in this test, what they do is they inject you with ACTH, a synthetic form of it, and then they test your blood levels at 30 minutes, an hour, and then 90 minutes, and so on and so forth, depending on what your doctor orders. And it tests, and then they also draw your blood to see how much cortisol is in it. Now, if you have normal adrenal function, those levels are going to rise. If you do not, you have adrenal insufficiency. There are also other tests for it, the insulin tolerance test. It's called an ITT test. That's a little more dangerous and not done quite as frequently, but basically the standard test is the ACTH stimulation test. So if you're craving salt, you're having energy issues, if you're struggling with your weight, I definitely recommend you having an ACTH stimulation test. For Cushing's, the standard test pretty much is a dexamethasone suppression test. And what that is that they give you a dexamethasone pill, which is a steroid, the night before, and then they test your blood the next morning, similar to the ACTH stim, and they're basically testing to see how much cortisol that you have. AM cortisol blood draws are also prominent in diagnostic testing for adrenal function. Like I said, there's some marker in endocrinology that there's no gradient. There's a good level and a bad level, but that depends on your opinion on adrenal fatigue. But anyways, pretty much the standard test for Cushing's and AI are the dexamethasone suppression test and the ACTH stim. Like I said, the ITT test is also a secondary diagnosis, but not as well done because it's got some higher risks. So let me just recap a little bit on the symptoms of AI if you think you could possibly be having adrenal issues. I personally believe that everybody who has chronic pain needs to have their cortisol level tested because cortisol is the body's stress hormone. Cortisol is your body's flight or fight response. And so if you are in constant pain, if you have constant issues, if you are facing a disease, if you have a stressful life, you need to know what your levels are. So when it comes to adrenal issues, excess fatigue, trouble getting up in the morning, this pretty much everybody who has adrenal insufficiency or any form of adrenal issues is going to complain of this wired but tired feeling. And I can certainly attest to that, because it's where you're so exhausted physically, but your mind just won't stop. And it's because of, the adrenals are a major part of your endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a major part of your whole body. And so when one part of the body doesn't work correctly, you're going to struggle and you're not going to have as great a quality of life as you want. So if you are thinking you're having adrenal issues, please don't hesitate to go see a reputable endocrinologist and request an AM cortisol lab, aldosterone labs, and if those come back, lower than normal, even low end of normal, I would definitely recommend the ACTH stimulation test. On the other side of the coin, if you're having major weight issues where you just are gaining weight constantly, if you have no energy, if you're having random bruising, if you're getting stretch marks, also have your cortisol levels tested, because those are signs of Cushing's. And as for adrenal insufficient patients, being on the right steroid dose is critical to your health. Like I said, Cushing's syndrome can even happen to those of us with Addison's disease because we don't have correct replacement. And dosing isn't always just the amount that you're on. It can be the time that you take it. Circadian rhythm is the key to life. And so when you have adrenal disease and you're having to synthetically create this endocrine process, you need to make sure that you have the right amount at the right time for your body. So if you are taking steroids for adrenal insufficiency, please make sure that you are taking them according to the circadian rhythm. And that is where you have the least in the evening and the most in the morning. And everyone is different. Some people may need their peak dose at 4 a.m. Some people may need it at 6. Some people may need it at midnight. It depends on your specific body and how you are as a person. Some people are early risers. Some people are night people. It just depends on your specific circadian rhythm. So you need to work with your endocrinologist to make sure that you're on the appropriate steroid dose and dosing schedule. Both of those two things are very important. And as far as explaining what AI is, if you are having trouble explaining what adrenal insufficiency is to your family or your friends, really use the comparison of diabetes. Because in diabetes, people need insulin, and people are very familiar with diabetics and that they, need insulin because of their blood sugar and they have to check this and that. Well, in adrenal insufficiency, we don't have a meter to check our cortisol levels. We can't prick our finger and know what our cortisol levels are. So we have to be constantly vigilant, and we have to carry emergency injections with us, just like the diabetics have to have the glucagon and everything like that. So AI is also an endocrine disorder, just like diabetes. It's just not as well known. So I just wanted to make that point as well. So this has been episode 3 of the Understanding Your Adrenals series, and I thank you for tuning in. Next week, we're going to be talking about our final episode on how to keep your adrenals healthy and how to prevent burnout. So thank you again for watching. My name is Winslow E. Dixon with the Adrenal Alternatives Foundation on ZubiaLive.